Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Wherever you are, welcome to the E-Institute's Emerging Issues in Economics webinar series that discusses cutting-edge issues and developments. We have experts from the World Bank and our partners share latest approaches on topics such as jobs, social entrepreneurship, green growth, and so on through online presentation. The goal of this webinar series is to educate and foster discussion around pressing issues in development. While it is targeted mostly towards policymakers and practitioners, everyone really is welcome to attend. Today we have a very interesting agenda planned. We have with us Mr. Indamit Gill, who is the Chief Economist, Europe and Central Asia region of the World Bank. He will highlight the key findings of a recent report that the World Bank has done on the European economic model. The report documents the achievements of the European growth model over the last 50 years and evaluates principal components of the model, including trade, finance, enterprise, innovation, labor, and government. So the discussion during the webinar will help you identify the main adjustments needed to make European finance work better, to better facilitate enterprise in parts of Europe which have begun to lag, and to address shortcomings of Europe's labor markets and governments. Before we get started, let me ask you to sign in, indicating, if you haven't done so already, indicating your name, email, and your organization in the chat window. So we'll give you 30 seconds, and then without much ado, I will turn it over to Indamit.
That's okay?
Yes, click here.
And then click here. Did you do it?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you very, very much, Sheila. I want to start by thanking the World Bank Institute for organizing the seminar. And then now actually let me get straight to the point. The issue that I will talk about today is Europe's economic growth problem. I think it may be the most urgent economic issue in the world today. And this is simply because I think that global economic prospects actually depend more on European economic growth than on any other single development in the world. And I say this especially because the world economy almost never has done well when Europe has had a bad year. There is another reason why this is an important issue, and this is because until 2008, most people thought that the best economic model is that of Europe, not America's or Asia's. It appears that this model had successfully combined a reliance on markets with a concern for people, and it appeared to yield both growth and equity. And what has happened is that over the last 4 years, this belief has dissipated, and Europeans especially have been losing faith in their approach. Now, if you had a bad economic model, it would be good to lose faith in it and to lose confidence in it quickly, and that would not be a reason to worry. But I'll show you that Europe's economic model has many good attributes, and one should not lose faith in it too quickly. The important point, though, is that even the strengths of the European economic model cannot allow Europe or any other part of the world to defy the laws of economics, right? So I'll start by giving you an answer to the question about, is austerity the answer to the growth problem in Europe? And the short answer is that austerity is necessary, but it is not sufficient. I think it is necessary for most countries in Europe to reduce their fiscal deficits. So, for example, Spain and Greece are expected this year to run a fiscal deficit of about 7% this year. It is difficult to call this austerity. Portugal will run a deficit of more than 5%. All the countries in Europe except 5, I think, have triggered the excessive deficit procedure that they have. And this is not austerity the way it is defined in other parts of the world. So you don't actually see that much austerity currently, and I think one needs to see more. And basically, I think that it would be necessary for much of Europe to spend less on what we call social protection at the World Bank. These are public pensions, unemployment insurance, and social welfare. But this won't be enough. What is also necessary is that Europe needs to rethink its approach to work. And more than a few countries in Europe have to make doing business a lot easier. So this is a pretty tall agenda, and I think that this is a reason to worry. It's a reason to worry because these changes will require a fundamental rethinking of what is the core of the European economic model, which deals with the balance between work and life. And this rethinking will be painful. But there's another reason to worry, and this is that in responding to these changes, Europe might get rid of some of the stronger components of the economic model. So what we've done over the last 2 years is that we worked on a report that tried to figure out what has been working well in Europe and should be kept, and what has been weakening Europe and should be changed. And to answer the question about how Europe can begin to grow again, I think we need to answer this question. So what are the strengths of Europe and what are the weaknesses? Now, to do this, we first needed, of course, to define what the European growth model is. And we took a very practical approach to this. We tried to identify the principal components of any growth model, or how the main economic activities are organized. And the main ones are trade and finance. So let me take you through a few slides now. So the main activities are trade and finance, enterprise and innovation, and labor and government, right? And what we try to do is we try to identify how Europe has organized these activities and how this is done differently in Europe than in other places, especially the Americas and East Asia. We also studied how different parts of Europe actually organize these activities differently. So I'm going to give you the short summary of the report, which tries to identify what are the strong points of the model and what are the weak. And the short answer to this is that trade and finance are the strongest parts of the model, and they're doing well in most parts of Europe. Enterprise and innovation are not weak either, and they're doing well in many parts of Europe. And labor and government are the weakest parts, and they're not doing well in most parts of Europe. And so this should give you a sense of what the report concludes about Europe's growth agenda. There are few changes that are required in trade and finance, some more in enterprise and in innovation, and many in labor and government, right? But I think what's important in trying to assess what is required for growth in Europe is to look at what have been the accomplishments of this European economic model. And to do this, one has to look back not the last 6 months or even the last 6 years, but the last 6 decades. And you have to put Europe's accomplishments into a global context, right? And when one does this, you find that Europe actually has had 3 major accomplishments. First, Europe has created what we call a convergence machine, which has not been invented anywhere else. And the simplest way for me to summarize this is that just as the United States has been taking in poor people and making them into high-income households, Europe has been taking in poor countries and making them into high-income economies. And this remarkable achievement of Europe is linked closely to the trade and finance components of the growth model. The second accomplishment is that Europe has become a global brand. And the simplest way for me to define this is that this is a unique combination of engineering and design that has made European goods and services valued and desired around the world. So if you read Isaacson's book on Steve Jobs, you will see how much European engineering and design inspired him and how much it has led to Apple's success. But the components of the growth model most closely linked with this achievement are enterprise and innovation. The third thing that Europe has done is that Europe became the world's lifestyle superpower. This term actually comes from 1990s Japan. As Japan caught up to the US, Prime Minister Miyazawa promised that his policies would make Japan the world's lifestyle superpower. But by 2000, with income still about a quarter short of those of the US, it was Europe that had become the world's lifestyle superpower. It had the highest quality of life in the world, essentially. And this has been most closely linked with the labor and the government components of the economic model. And you see from these achievements that those that will be easy to keep are those that are linked with the convergence machine. It'll take a bit more work to keep brand Europe, and it'll take many changes to stay the world's lifestyle superpower. But let me take you through a few slides on each one of these. I'm going to start with Europe as a convergence machine, and then I'll go into the other two. So here's a slide that really surprised me when I first saw it. And what these slides do is that they plot the growth of consumption per capita over 4 decades since 1970 on the vertical axis, and the initial income or consumption level that the country started with in 1970 on the horizontal axis. And what you see in this chart is that in Latin America, the growth was about 2% on average, and there was no convergence. That is, a country that was poor in 1970 did not grow systematically faster or slower than a country that was rich to start with. In East Asia, what you see is that the average growth rate is about 4%, twice as that of Latin America, but no convergence again. Right? And then you see in Europe, you see a fantastic convergence. What you see there is that the poorest countries grew at around 4% per year, and the richest around 2%. And both these are actually remarkable, because growing at around 1% per year over long periods is what has made the US the biggest economy in the world. Now, this is what a convergence machine does. This is what it looks like. So if you look at this, it is a map of the world with trade flows, and what you find is that in 2008, which is the last normal year for trade, Europe did about half of the world's trade in goods and services, and about 2/3 of this is actually within Europe, but this is precisely the close economic integration between richer and poorer countries that is the big driver of convergence in Europe. Now, people in Europe, especially especially people in emerging Europe, have one concern. They say that their economies are becoming overly dependent on Western Europe, and Western Europe isn't doing so well, so this doesn't spell good things for them. Actually, this does not seem to be true, and these charts show that. You find that actually the share of the new member states in Western Europe's exports and imports actually doubled over the decade. The opposite has been happening in the case of the exports of the new member states. They actually have been becoming less and less dependent on Western Europe. So European integration is a very nice thing. It means both integration within Europe and integration of European countries with the rest of the world. Okay. The other thing that has been happening is that the trade within Europe has actually become more and more sophisticated over time. It's not of cruder products like tires and plastics. What you find is that the exports of the new member states in the European Union, for example, have become much more sophisticated over time and very, very quickly. So, for example, German FDI has now led to exports of quite sophisticated things from Poland, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. And these exports have also been going to other parts of the world, including India and so on. Now, that was trade. The other big component of the convergence machine is finance. Europe has seen the largest capital flows in the world, perhaps in recorded human history. And these charts show you that between 2001 and 2004, the EU's new member states and the candidate countries received capital flows of about 6% of GDP. If you compare those with East Asia and with Latin America, you see that they are actually more than twice those of those countries. And then what you find is, if you look at the second panel of this chart, between 2005 and 2008, these flows actually essentially doubled, right? And even countries like Ukraine and others got big inflows. Contrast this with what was happening in East Europe and Latin America, much, much smaller flows. What you find is that a large chunk of these flows actually, even in Eastern Europe and so on, have been FDI, which tends to stay for a long time. And what you also find is that foreign banks moved into emerging Europe and set up profitable operations. Now, the thing that concerns people are those dots that you see these charts, and these are the dots below the horizontal line, which went, and these are the current account deficits. And these went from about 6% in 2001 to 2004 to about 9% by the time of the global economic crisis. And this development has raised many questions, because this was especially what was happening in countries like Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain. These are the countries that got into trouble. Now, but the way to see if these flows are good and bad is to look at this chart, is to see whether or not these capital flows led to growth during the 2000s, or did they just add to greater vulnerability. And what we find is that when we looked at the growth rates of 4 sets of countries, these are the new member states of the European Union, the candidates to the Union, the Eastern Partnership countries, countries like Ukraine and Belarus, and emerging economies outside of Europe, right? And what you find is that countries in Europe, especially the new member states and the candidate countries, actually benefited a lot from these capital flows. Outside of Europe, you actually find that countries did better if they exported capital rather than got inflows of capital. They did better if they kept their deficits small, and even better if they had current account surpluses. Now, what is better? Do we want capital to flow from richer countries to poorer countries, or do we want it to go the other way around? And the answer is obvious. What we want is capital to go from low growth countries to high growth countries, from richer countries to poorer countries. That way, if foreign capital is available to these poorer countries, they can consume more and invest more, and they can grow faster. The main point is what these capital flows went into. And what you find is that when you start to look at that, here's a chart that actually tells you whether or not these flows led to greater investments or greater debt, right? And what you find is that in the case of the new member states of Europe, you actually find that a large part of these flows went into investment. In the case of the EU South, countries like Greece and Portugal and Spain, a large chunk of this money actually went into consumption. And basically, what this indicates is that if you create good conditions for investing, foreign capital goes into investment. And this is what happened. This is what happened in countries like Poland and Czech Republic and Slovakia in Eastern Europe. If not, foreigners lend for consumption, and they tend to leave when things turn bad. And this is essentially what happened in Southern Europe. I'll show you a few more slides about this. But what we say in the report is that it won't be difficult to restart the convergence machine. To get it going again, Europe has to stabilize finance and then put the services, trade, and labor mobility at the center of the growth agenda. Now, we also get asked a question saying, why should the convergence machine be restarted? And the best reason is the one that I heard from Marek Belka, who is the president of the National Bank of Poland. And a few months ago, he introduced a report to the Russians, and he assessed Poland's performance in each of the 6 components of the growth model. And he concluded, and I quote, he said, "These have been the best 20 years in Polish history." And I don't think you could ask for a better reason to start the convergence machine. It has helped 100 million people in countries like Greece, Italy, and Spain converge to levels of living of those of their northern neighbors. It helped another 100 million people in the new member states get closer to high income. It is now helping another 100 million people in the candidate and the potential candidate countries of the European Union, like Turkey and Serbia, do the same thing. And we say that if it is restarted, it will help them get to high income. And then it might also help the 75 million people in countries like Ukraine and Georgia experience the best years in their history as well. So we actually are very, very positive about the convergence machine achievement of the European Union as well as Europe, and we think that it's easy to actually keep this achievement because it is associated with the components of the European economic model that are doing rather well. This is trade and finance. Now, what about the next achievement, which is Europe as a global brand? What is it that Europe needs to do to keep keep this achievement? So here is a chart which is a fairly complicated looking chart, and it really surprised me also when I first saw it. It looks at how European enterprises have done compared with firms in other parts of the world. So what you find is that between 1994 and 2009, there were very noisy developments outside of Europe. East Asia had a big crisis, and then there was the rise of China, and the US had an ICT boom and a financial crisis. During this time, European enterprises have quietly flourished. They have been delivering jobs, productivity, and exports. They have essentially added jobs at the same rate as the US. They have increased productivity faster than East Asia, and they have generated more exports than Latin America, right? That's what this chart tells you. But what this chart also tells you is that the picture is not good across the board. Job creation could have been higher in the new member states, the candidates, and that export propensity should be greater in the southeast and the south of Europe, and productivity growth should have been higher in the EU 15 countries, the advanced countries of Europe, at least as high as that of the US, because productivity levels in Europe had not reached those of the US until the 1990s. So what we do in the book is that we actually focus on productivity growth because it is the best indicator of the health of enterprises. And this chart tells you what has been happening to productivity in the European Union relative to the United States. So everything is normalized to the productivity level of the US in each year. And what these charts essentially what these lines tell you is what has been happening in the countries like France and Germany, which is the top line, then countries like Finland and Sweden, which is the second line, then countries like Italy and Spain and Portugal and Greece, which is the third line, and then countries in Eastern Europe, countries like Poland and Czech Republic and so on, which is the fourth line. And what you see are two gaps emerging. The first gap is the gap between the North and the South, which has grown from about 10% in 1990 to about 25% in 2010. The second gap is the gap between the EU's continental economies, like France and Germany and the Netherlands, and the US, and that has been growing too, especially since 1995. Now, when you look at the first gap, in 2002, what we find is that productivity levels were actually higher in Northern and Continental Europe, lower in Southern Europe, and lower still in the new member states. And there is nothing wrong with this. Essentially, what this tells you that a worker in Belgium was around twice as productive as a worker in Greece, who in turn was about twice as productive as a worker in Hungary, who in turn was twice as productive as a worker in Latvia or Lithuania. There's nothing wrong with this because these countries are essentially ranked from those that are wealthiest to those that are the poorest in a sense. But what we would expect is that between 2002 and 2009 or so, we would expect these gaps to become smaller. And so what we should have seen was that that productivity growth should be highest in the countries that started out from low productivity levels, and productivity growth should be lowest but still positive among the countries that had high productivity levels, countries like Norway and Ireland and Denmark and so on. And in between, countries like Italy, Spain, and Portugal and so on should have medium productivity growth rates. What you actually find is that only two of those three things is true. What you find is that productivity growth was indeed high in the East. It was indeed positive and low in Northern Europe and in continental Europe, with the exception of the Netherlands. But what you see is this hole in the middle, where you see that instead of productivity levels increasing at a fairly rapid rate in countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, and Portugal, you ended up seeing negative productivity growth. These countries were going in the wrong direction, so real convergence in the South essentially went into reverse. So we spent quite a bit of time to see why did this happen, and I think this actually chart is at the core of the crisis especially in the Eurozone, but also in Europe. What we found was that these countries had entrepreneurial structures that were not suited for a big integrated European market. Simply put, enterprises in these countries were just way too small. So in most of Europe, for example, enterprises with less than 10 workers account for around 1/5 of value added, but in the South it is almost a third, right? And these micro firms were too small to attract FDI or to international sales and purchases. What's the reason for this? The main reason that we found is that the climate for doing business is the biggest part of the reason why the South is in trouble today. So here is a chart that summarizes the ease of doing business in 2011, scaling it from 0 to 100. 100 is excellent, and so the US is around 91. You see Japan at around 83. You see countries like Switzerland and others at around 80. And then you see a big difference between some countries in the European Union, especially those in the north, which do as well as those of the US, for example, economy. But then what you find is that continental countries like Germany and others do just okay, but countries in the south, especially Greece, do really poorly. So if you look at our rankings, for example, Greece comes in 100th out of 180 countries, and then you also see that countries like Italy come in at 87th and so on. This is the biggest part of the problem. So this is a reason why we say that austerity is not enough, because what these countries actually have to do is improve the climate for their enterprises, right? Let me go on to actually talk about the gap between the South and the rest. I had spoken about two productivity gaps. So we tried to look at what are the reasons for the widening productivity gap between Western Europe's leaders, like countries like France and Germany, and those of the world's innovation leader, which is the United States. And this productivity gap had almost been closed in 1995, but since that time has widened again. Here we could not find easy answers. When one looks at the climate for doing business, it is only part of the answer, but probably a very small part. The main thing that we found is that Europe seems to specialize in low innovation sectors like aerospace and things like pharmaceuticals, while the US is much more active in things like computer hardware and software and healthcare, so on. And this is essentially because of the absence of young innovative enterprises in new sectors in Europe as compared to the US. Now, that's actually just restating the problem and not giving you an answer to it. We try to look for the reasons for this, and what we find is that the most likely reasons are that one is that the European market is not integrated not like that of the US, especially for services. The second one is that Europe does not have world-class universities the way countries like the US have. And then the third one is that the quality of business management tends to be higher in places like the US. And finally, the US actually does better in terms of trying to get private universities to take advantage of public R&D as well as do R&D themselves and so on. What we also find, by the way, is that there are some countries in Europe that actually do a pretty good job of all of these things, and these countries actually look a lot like the US when it comes to their innovation systems. These are countries like Finland, Switzerland, Denmark, and the UK. The trouble is that these countries tend not to be that big, other than the UK, right? So we conclude that it's not going to be very difficult for Europe to actually keep its global brand, but it'll have to do quite a few things more than keeping the convergence machine. The first one is that governments in Southern Europe will have to improve their business climate. The second one is that continental countries will have to give their enterprises much more economic freedom. I'm talking about countries like France and Germany, and do some of the things that countries like the US, Switzerland, and Denmark and others have been doing. And then enterprises in the south, in places like Finland and Sweden and so on, that are already among the most innovative in the world, must be provided fuller access to markets in the rest of Europe. This won't be easy, but it won't be impossible. Right? The thing that actually Europe has to confront, and confront quickly, are things associated with it being the lifestyle superpower. So I show you another chart that surprised me, and it shows you what superpowers do. Superpowers tend to spend a lot, right? So the US is the military superpower, and it spends more on defense than the next 15 countries put together. That's the first pie chart, right? The second one is what you see in Europe. Europe is the world's lifestyle superpower, and to protect its way of life, Europe spends more on social protection. These are public pensions, unemployment insurance, and social welfare, than the rest of the world combined. Okay? So with 10% of the world's population, 30% of the world's GDP, Europe spends 60% of the world's social protection spending, right? And you have to ask yourself whether or not this is sustainable. And the answer is it is, if you really spend this money very, very well. And what do I mean by that? I mean that you have to spend this money in ways that keep people in the labor force for as long as possible. You have to spend this money in ways that get young people into jobs very, very quickly. And Europe hasn't been doing that very well. Now, the big problem also is that Europe faces very adverse demographics as compared to countries like the US. What we find is that under current conditions, Europe will lose about 1 million workers each year for the next 50 years, most of them young workers actually. Now, this is part of the reason why. The first one is that because of greater prosperity, Europeans have been stopping work earlier and earlier in their lifetimes. So this chart tells you that since the mid-90s, men in Poland, Turkey, Hungary, France and Spain, for example, have been working about 10 years less than they used to, while expecting to live longer when they reach 1960. In France's case, for example, about 6 years more. So in France's case, which is the fourth bar from the right, what you see is that pension systems will have to pay pensions for about 15 more years now as compared to back in the 1960s. And those of you who worked in pensions know that it's impossible to design pension systems that can take such a big hit, right? Now, this is not true across all of Europe. If you look at the other side, for example, you find that Germany, Czech Republic, Slovakia, and so on, actually men are not retiring earlier. In the case of Germany, they're actually retiring a bit later, right? But part of the problem is that because of all of this stuff, because of this greater spending on social protection, what you see is that European governments spend about 10% of GDP more as compared to similar as compared to the governments in similar countries across in parts of the world like in East Asia and in Latin America. And what we also found was that almost all of this difference, about 90% of this difference, is because they spend more on social protection, not because they spend more on education and health and so on. It's important to look at this chart because if you really try to identify which components of government spending add the most to growth, it's hardest to actually make the case that social protection spending adds a lot to growth. It's easier to make the case that health spending, infrastructure spending, education spending actually add more to growth. In the case of Europe, European governments tend to spend a lot more on social protection, and this is going to actually affect growth a lot more, right? Now, we also try to see is this because Europe actually looks after its elderly, for example, or its unemployed more? So here's a chart that actually indicates that it's not that other parts of the world like Japan and Australia and the US and others don't look after their elderly. They also look after the elderly. In fact, in terms of per person per year subsidies to the elderly, they're roughly the same in Europe as compared to Japan and the US and so on. That is what the left bars show over here. But what you find is when it comes to the overall drain on the treasury, you actually find that that drain is about 3 times as high in countries like Greece and Spain and Italy as compared to countries like Australia and the US. 4.2% in the case of the Anglo-Saxon countries and 12.6% in the case of the EU15 South. And it's because, not because these countries actually look after their elderly more or better, they just define who is elderly differently. So it's much more easy to be eligible for these pension benefits in Europe as compared to other parts of the world. This is the biggest part of the problem on social protection, and this is the part that Europe will have to deal with. Now, what we did was, as part of this report, we tried to see how much of a fiscal correction does Europe have to do. And what you see in this chart is both because of current fiscal deficits and high public debt, and because of adverse demographics. And essentially what you find is that you need a massive correction. Western Europe has to reduce fiscal deficits by about 10% of GDP by about 6% of GDP. In the South, it's about 10%, right? So I think that for people to be asking these countries to be spending more, to be incurring higher fiscal deficits, is actually just not a responsible thing to do. Right? So I'm going to try to sum up now, and I mean essentially what we find is that because the European growth model has so many strengths, Europe should be careful in changing it, even in response to the crisis that it is facing right now. But it does need to make some changes to preserve what has been achieved. Once again, it is important to underline what Europe has achieved. Europe is a convergence machine that makes it a great place if you are a middle-income country. Europe has a global influence that is based on painstakingly building a unique brand over many decades, and this is an asset for the advanced economies. And for all Europeans, it has meant a high quality of life that is actually the highest in the world and perhaps in human history, and it is worth struggling to keep these nice things. This is a chart that actually tells you what it needs to do, but I think that what we end up saying is that one has to start with austerity because of the charts that I just showed you, but you can't stop there. You also have to make it easier easier for business, especially in the EU15 South, but also in other parts of the thing, and to actually look carefully at how to make labor markets much more competitive. We actually also find is that you have lots of countries in Europe that have large governments, but they actually have made these governments very efficient. These are countries like Sweden and Finland and so on. But you have many more countries that have large governments that are not efficient, and these countries either have to make they have to make these government services more efficient, or they have to make government size much smaller, right? And it's easier to actually make it smaller than to make it more efficient. So at least in the short term, the answer is to have smaller governments, not bigger governments. When governments can be made more efficient, they can become bigger. Let me stop here and take your questions. Yes. Okay, in fact, I'm not going to take your questions. I'm going to give you questions. The first question that we ask you is, do you think, after hearing what I just told you, do you think that fiscal austerity is helping countries in the region, even though you hear that it is hurting countries in the region, especially in Europe? And the answers are yes, no, not sure, or no vote. Right? The second one is, I stop there? No, I should discuss this.
Yeah, for a moment.
It says that it's not helping. That's what people are saying. About 40% say that it is helping, and about 50% say that it is hurting them. So I didn't convince about 50% of the people. I'm actually quite impressed that I convinced 35% of the people. I should take some questions from here. The second thing, okay. Which are the areas do you think the biggest problems lie in Europe's current economic model? And so this one goes down. A is trade, B is finance, C is enterprise, D is innovation, E is labor, F is government, and G is other. So which is the weakest part, in a sense, of the European economic model? Is it trade, for example, or is it finance, or is it labor or government? Right? That pretty much accords with what. Got it. That pretty much accords with what I would say too. It's very difficult to separate these components. Trade and finance tend to go together, and they're pretty strong. Enterprise and innovation tend to go together, and they're pretty doing well in many parts of Europe, except for countries like Italy and Greece. And then labor and government are the parts that are weak in many parts of Europe. And I think that this one comes out pretty much right. Let's go to question 3, which is, what do you think is the most difficult challenge Europe will face in restoring long-term growth? Is it to facilitate modern services, especially the trade in modern services? Is it to start increasing productivity again? or is it to adjust to the rapid aging of the population and the low fertility rates, where, or you're not sure? Yeah, that accords with what I would say too, which is that actually Europe is quite remarkable. About 72% of people say that it is to adjust to demographic trends, and I think that's right. 78%. Thanks. Then the last question is, do you see the future European economic model looking, how different would it be? Is it not different at all? Not different, but just a minor adjustment, or different with a major adjustment required? And I think people have it about right. I think it depends on which part of Europe you are in. I think as you go closer to the north, it is actually minor adjustments required. As you go closer to the south, it is major adjustments required. But one of the charts that I didn't show you was how you actually find that the same model has been applied very, very differently in different parts of Europe, and some parts of Europe have really made it work. So as part of this, what we did was in 16 policy areas, we tried to identify good practice from around the world and in Europe, and it was very easy to identify countries in Europe that had done very well in this. If you look at the book, you'll actually find lots of evidence on this one. So you have countries in Europe that have actually done really well in applying this model. I'm talking about countries like Sweden and Germany, and even countries like Poland and Czech Republic and Slovakia and others that have actually done this well. In fact, I play a game with my American friends who always tell me, as soon as they hear that I'm working in Europe, they say, you must be a very busy guy because every country in Europe is in trouble. And I always say, no, actually, I can play a game with you. You name a country in Europe that you think is in trouble, and I'll name you two that are not. And I usually win the game. Yeah? So you actually find a whole bunch of countries in Europe that have applied this model well, that have actually done quite well. I'm talking about countries like Sweden and Switzerland that are outside the euro area, but I'm also talking about countries like Finland and Germany and Slovakia and Austria and others that are in the euro area. Let me try to take a quick look at one of the questions that people have been asking. Well, the first question is, are we not witnessing the end of Western capitalism? That is a good one. I think one of the I can't give a short answer to this question because it's a very complex one, but I can give you part of the answer. But the part of the answer is that Europe is facing a problem of aging populations and declining fertility. But I think that this is a problem that that will sooner or later be faced by other parts of the world as well. So I'm talking about East Asia, for example. I'm talking about Latin America as well as the US and so on. And I think that the way Europe handles this problem actually will not only determine its own future, but can also show other parts of the world how to best get how to both live long and prosper in a sense, right? So I think that is a big problem that I think most of the world will face ultimately, is to get the best out of aging populations. And what we actually find is that you do have countries in Europe that are actually doing pretty well at this. I'm talking about small countries like Iceland and so on, but I'm also talking about larger countries like Germany. Then there was another question, said that why don't European countries apply the policies that they recommended and urged African developing countries to implement in the 1980s? Actually, I would say that there are some things that European countries have told other parts of the world, which is like to trade more and so on, that they've also applied very well. So you actually find Europe is the trade center of the world. But there are other parts. I think the part that Europe has been recommending to others, I think, which is essentially to have large spending on social protection and things. This is something that countries in Europe need to consider, and countries in other parts of the world also need to consider. That one should think twice before you put in large social protection programs. I'm talking about countries in Latin America and so on. There was another question about, for a small country like Portugal with no exchange rate policy, no monetary policy, and its fiscal policy severely constrained, where is the room for an active public policy? I'll give you a short answer to this. The problem with countries like Portugal and Greece and others is that they are small, closed economies. Okay? And there is no room for a small, closed economy in a globalized world, especially in a very integrated Europe. So what these countries really have to do is actually become small, open economies. So I'm talking, for example, if you look at the share of exports to GDP, for countries like the Czech Republic, Slovenia, Slovakia, and others, this is greater than 60%. If you look at countries like Portugal and Greece, which are small economies too, it is half that ratio. They actually have export to GDP ratios of less than 30%. That is just not sustainable. You have to actually increase your integration with the rest of Europe by exporting more and so on. So I think the biggest part of public policy is to actually encourage greater trade. Now, to do this, mostly what they have to do is improve the investment climate. Not all countries have to do the same things, but most of these countries have to make it easier for enterprises to grow and trade and so on. Right? There's another question. Is austerity in the short term a hindrance to growth? I think, okay, this is a trickier question, but I think the best way to look at this is to see which are the countries that are growing fastest in Europe today, right? These countries are countries like Sweden, countries like Finland, Germany, I mean, I guess even countries like Denmark and so on. And now Taka and I, we were actually looking at which are the countries that are not part of the excess deficit procedures in Europe, right? You actually find these countries is Germany, Sweden, Estonia, Finland, Luxembourg, right? These countries actually tend to have the highest growth rates as well. They have the lowest fiscal deficits. All the fiscal deficits are less than 3%, and they have the highest growth rates. So I'm not sure whether or not it is austerity that is hurting. I mean, you would think of these countries actually implementing the greatest austerity programs in a sense, but it does not seem to be hurting growth. If you look at these countries, they tend to do very well in our doing business rankings. They tend to be in the top 20, all of them. And I think that's the key. The other part of the key is, of course, if you spend a lot on government, you have to spend it efficiently. So countries like Finland, for example, are very efficient at spending on education and health. They have the best education and health programs in the world, I think, and so on. And then you find Estonia doing something, same thing. Sweden actually has one of the best climate for its enterprises in the world. It actually does that very well. They actually show what small open economies should look like, right? So I'm not sure about whether or not. I think that austerity, if you are spending a lot more than you're bringing in, it's almost certain that people will demand very high interest rates in order for you to be able to borrow. And I think that many countries in Europe probably will see that they will be able to spend a lot more on other things if they cut down their spending a little bit, because the cost of borrowing from them will actually decline a lot. Right? Any other questions? There was another one about what are the level of European countries to gain productivity, taking into account liability, such a thing. Okay, so essentially there is actually another question about I think it talks about thresholds. How much should countries be spending and so on. We actually looked at this question a fair amount. The first thing that we found is that when countries start to spend more than 40% of their GDP on government, they have to make sure that they are spending this money really, really well. Otherwise, they get into trouble. And this is just common sense, in the sense that if you don't have efficient government, why would you spend 50% of your GDP through this inefficient part of your economy? So the first one is, what we find is that once you hit around 40% of GDP, you start to pay a growth price unless you increase efficiency of government spending. The second thing that we find is that if in Europe, if your rank in our doing business indicators is greater than 40th, I'm talking about countries like Spain, for example, which is at around 40. Then you have countries like Italy at 87th. You have countries like Greece, which are at 100. And once you go above 40, you're going to pay a price in terms of growth, because you are not a good destination for foreign direct investment, right? And it starts to hurt you, and you soon start to become a small closed economy, which then starts starts a vicious downward spiral. The third thing that we find is that if you spend more than 10% of GDP on social protection, watch out. Because what you're then doing is that you're taking money away from things that actually do add to growth. I'm talking about infrastructure spending, especially in the case of poorer countries, but health and education for all the countries as well. So these three things, 40% of GDP, 40th rank in the doing business, and 10% of GDP on social protection spending, these are thresholds that countries in Europe have to watch out for. I think I've answered some of the questions now. Actually, Jim Stevens asked a good question. I think I tried to answer your question, Jim, about austerity in the short run. It can hinder growth, but in the long run, it would be beneficial. Can you give a bit of color on the role of debt financing in convergence? I think that the real question over here, there is quite a big debate about this, about whether or not countries can borrow abroad and grow. And I think that there's a very common sense answer to this. If you borrow abroad, you better use this money very, very well, so that you have to use this money in ways that add to GDP, that increase productivity of your enterprises and so on. And so if you do that, you end up using that money well, and you end up taking advantage of these capital flows that are very, very large in Europe. It turns out that there is a fairly simple way to ensure that this money goes to the right things. It's not to actually try to put in regulations that say you can't lend for consumption, etc., because those things never work. But what does work is that if you improve the environment for investment, it turns out that people will invest, especially foreigners who have a lot of money. If you have a lousy environment for investment, people will actually only go short in your country. They will lend for consumption. And then when things turn bad, you will actually find that you will see a very quick outflow of foreign capital. Now you see that outflow from countries like Greece and Spain and Italy. You don't see that outflow from countries like Poland and the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic and so on. Mainly because these countries have actually improved the quality of the investment climate by a lot over the last 20 years. There is another question by Shu Fang, who says, what should be the source of growth of European countries during the crisis? I think that any steps that they can take to improve competitiveness, especially in world markets, because you can still sell to countries like the US, which have a large GDP and some growth. You can still sell to countries like China and India and Brazil and Russia, which are actually growing still, but you need to be competitive for that. So you need to be competitive abroad, and the second one is you need to be efficient at home. If you're spending a lot of money, that means you are also taxing a lot. And if you're taxing a lot, that means that you're discouraging work and enterprise. So you have to cut your taxes, and the best way to do that is to essentially try to become much more efficient at home in terms of government spending. I'll try to There's another one. I see a question from Dusko from Serbia. What are the key barriers to the growth of enterprise in Southern Europe? Why do so many companies stay small? Dusko, the answer to this is that if you look at the 10 indicators on our doing business rankings, they tend to be these countries tend not to do very well in those, right? The exception is Portugal. And the key, I think, in Portugal is something that used to be included in our doing business rankings, but which isn't anymore, which is, how efficient are the labor markets there, especially employment protection legislation. That has been taken out of the doing business rankings. When we did the work for the report, we actually included that back in, and then you actually find that Spain and Portugal tend not to do very well at all. And basically it is these things that actually keep companies very small. But if you want the longer answer to this, take a look at chapter 4 in the report. It actually really goes into this in a fair amount of detail. Sheila?
Thank you very much, Indamit, for the very interesting and just-in-time presentation. I also the participants we had, for most part, about 50 participants, despite the competition at the same time with the World Bank President's town hall. So that was a very good turnout. We thank you for your questions and the interesting back-channel conversations you were having. Just wanted to mention that by this evening we should have the video of Indamit as well as the PowerPoint, which is already there on the E-Institute's website. You see the address as we speak. And also wanted to alert you to the next webinar that's coming up on climate smart agriculture, developing agricultural carbon projects. It's on November 7th, same time, 10 to 11 Eastern Standard Time. And along with the webinar information, if you go into the E-Institute e-courses section, you will see about over 15 courses in the whole area of emerging economics and growth and competitiveness. And you'll also see some information on how to register there. So see you all the next time. Thank you.